And now, let me turn to one of the suspense stories now in the world. For the last 25 years, the largest religious denomination in the world, the Roman Catholic Church, has been governed by a very, very popular pope, also a controversial pope. His name, John Paul II. And when he achieved power in 1978, and as you may remember, it was a very bizarre circumstance. John the 23rd, who had called Vatican Council II in 1959, and the council began in 1962, one of the most revolutionary councils in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, died in the middle of the council. He died in 1963, and he was succeeded by Paul VI, who was the Pope from 63 to 1978. But in 1978, Paul VI himself died, and they elected another Italian. That was the custom, had been going on for centuries. The popes were always Italian, sometimes southern, sometimes northern, sometimes central, but generally, generally Italian. And so they elected an Italian pope who took the name John Paul I. And then, shortly after he was elected, he died. I don't think most people remember John Paul I. He was like a passing phase. He died. A few weeks after his election, he died. And of course, that has been the subject of many interesting books. The world is filled with people with conspiratorial theories. Did he die a natural death? Was he killed in the halls or in the bedrooms of the Vatican? All of the speculation. I mean, he most likely died a natural death. And then they had to call all the cardinals back in 1978. And they chose, for the first time in centuries, they chose a non-Italian. Now, you would expect it most likely would have been French or Spanish or Portuguese or German, something in Western Europe. No. They chose the leading figure of the Catholic Church in Poland, Karol Wojtyła, who was the Archbishop of Kraków, or Krakow as you say it in German. So he was chosen. And in 1978, when he showed up in Rome, he was a tall, vigorous man who spoke many, many languages, viewed by the world as being very, very brilliant. And so he started out his reign with a great flash, because one of the things he decided to do at the very, very beginning was to travel. Now, the Pope that I grew up with did travel for diplomatic reasons, but he basically chose what I would call the inner sanctum of the Vatican. He was a very austere figure, very different from John Paul II. You may remember him, Pius XII. He reigned from 1939 until 1958. And he became a very controversial figure in the world because he was the Pope during the Second World War. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church had to decide how it would respond to Hitler and to the Nazi threat. But Pius XII was very austere. He was a prince of the church. He fit into the old model of what we call the Pope. The last thing the Pope most likely would do would be to shake hands. But John Paul II, almost from the beginning, like a media star, right, who discovered television, went off all over the world. Name a country that he hasn't been to. The one country that I can think of is Antarctica. Because converting penguins, obviously, has limited possibilities for the Roman Catholic Church. But he's been everywhere. He's been to every Catholic country. He's been to most countries that are Protestant. He's been to Muslim countries. He's been to a Hindu place. I mean, wherever it is, he's traveling. Hard to find in Rome. And certainly for the first 20 years of his papacy, he pioneered a new kind of papacy, or I would call it a populist papacy. He became one of the great media stars. There are two great religious media stars in the world. One is from Rome, formerly from Poland. His name, Pope John Paul II. The second is from Tibet. His name is the Dalai Lama. And now all over the world, people who couldn't even tell you who the Pope was, if they were not Catholic, know who the Pope is. They may know absolutely nothing about the Roman Catholic Church or its history. He has become this star. And he changed the whole style of the papacy. The style of the papacy was now to do what American politicians do, sometimes overdo, which is they go out to the what? To the people, shake hands, kiss babies, talk to the people, meet the people, the whole thing. It's an entirely new vision of what it means to be the Pope. So on one level, he was viewed, certainly through his career, over the last 25 years. It's 25 years, 1978, 2003. Over the last 20 years, he's been viewed as a kind of pioneer pope. On the other hand, he's a controversial pope because there are many people who view him as a very conservative pope, not a pioneer pope. John Paul II is the pope who will not change the priesthood. He will not have married priests, do you understand? Under no circumstances. There may be no priests signing up or nobody signing up for the seminaries. He will not have any married priests. The thought that a woman could become a priest, never. On the issue of abortion, it is very clear what the teaching of the church is. No. On the issue of euthanasia, it's very clear what the teaching of the church is. No. On the issue of birth control, it is very clear what the teaching of the church is. No. And on the issue of homosexuality, it is very clear what the teaching of the church is. No, no. Now, these positions are interpreted as kind of conservative. He's a very interesting figure, isn't he? On the one side, he's a kind of a radical pioneer using the media. On the other hand, in terms of what we call ideological or theological issues or moral issues, he takes what is considered to be generally a conservative position. During the course of his papacy, he has appointed dozens and dozens of bishops. Some of these bishops he turned into cardinals. Cardinals belong to a special group of people who, when the Pope dies, are invited to elect the next Bishop of Rome. In fact, he has increased the size of the College of Cardinals. It's much, much bigger than it ever has been. And the people he has now appointed as bishops, many of whom have become cardinals, reflect his point of view. Now, the Pope is presiding over a troubled church. It's not a church that's at ease or comfortable with an enormous sense of confidence for the future. It's a troubled church. And over the last 2 to 3 years, it has become very clear to the public that the Pope is dying. We're all dying, by the way. I said, no, it's inevitable. I hate to bring up this sad, this sad piece of news. The moment we're born, we're moving toward dying. All right, but I mean, his death is going to be soon, and so that has aroused a great deal of speculation, because the Pope is not simply a figurehead president of the Church. He comes, he goes. It doesn't make any difference. The Pope, in terms of the evolution of the Roman Catholic Church, is viewed as the very mouth of God. He is the absolute monarch. When he speaks ex cathedra from his throne, he speaks with the authority of God. Therefore, who will succeed him certainly is important, because the successor will determine to some degree both the direction and the survival of the Roman Catholic Church. So in order to talk about John Paul II and who may succeed him, let me just give you some background now in terms of two important institutions. One is called the Roman Catholic Church, and the other one is called the papacy. All right. One of the most powerful jobs in the world. Well, the papacy has its roots in four things that are very important. The first, it has its roots in religion. Religion is not simply something you believe. What you believe is invisible. Nobody knows what you believe. What is visible is behavior. Religion is a behavior. The most unique form of religious behavior is called worship. It's a uniquely religious behavior. You may be sincere about it, you may be insincere about it. It doesn't make any difference. If you do it, you are part of the world of religion. Religion involves rites and rituals and sacraments and behaviors that in many cases and in many societies in the world take up a large part of people's time. And in fact, the history of religion is that people are willing to invest enormous amounts of their wealth in the institutions of religion. So it can't be trivial. I mean, most people don't even want to pay taxes. I mean, if you're voluntarily giving your money, then it has to be something of great importance. And of course, religion is something of great importance because it touches on the two great problems of life which the Pope is presently experiencing. They're called suffering and death. And religion proposes, or historically has proposed, to defeat them in some way. Certainly about 2,500 years ago, there arose in the world a series of salvation religions of great power that promised to defeat both suffering and death. There was Rabbinic Judaism, there was Christianity, there was Islam, and certainly in the East there arose the religion of Buddhism. And they arose close enough. It's a period of time in the history of the world when religion suddenly turned and focused on the individual and addressed the two issues, the two very important issues in life of suffering and death. So the power of the papacy lies in the fact that this man, or whoever has the job, it used to be said, held the keys to the kingdom, right? The keys to the kingdom of heaven. Well, that's better than the U.S. Treasury, certainly today. All right. No, it's the keys to the kingdom. So we're not talking about a trivial activity, because today in a very secular world, people may belong to religious institutions, but they don't take up a lot of their time. That is not the history of religion, and the Roman Catholic Church and the institution of the papacy would not have grown that way. The second, of course, is the salvation religion called Christianity. And the salvation religion called Christianity was very, very successful. It did certain things very well. One, it provided something that other salvation religions didn't always do. It provided tightly knit communities, which could be support groups for you. People are always looking for support groups. There are two kinds of religions. There are shrine religions and there are community religions, or congregational ones. Shrine religions are like Japan. You want to get some help, you show up at the shrine, you don't have to join anything. You understand? You leave your contribution and you leave. Community religions are you join a group, and you are a member of the group, and the group initiates you into the group, and the group is there, both locally and beyond locally, to help you. In Christian terms, we call it the church. So Christianity is not simply a shrine religion. Christianity is a congregational or community religion. And that was one of the reasons for its success, because many of the other competitors of Christianity provided only shrines. They didn't provide tight-knit support groups or communities. Certainly one of the reasons for the success of Christianity, and it's reflected in the papacy, was that it produced an extraordinary clergy. It's one of the most successful priesthoods in the history of humanity. And attached to the priesthood, of course, was an extraordinary celebration. And you've seen the Pope, every time the Pope goes anywhere, they create this big field or the stadium, and there is this incredible Eucharist or Mass that is put on. One of the most dramatic rituals ever devised by humanity. It is incredible in its greatest splendor. And in fact, at the heart of the Mass is the ability of people to establish direct contact through the wine and the wafer, direct contact with spiritual power. All right, like ingesting it. Very important. Certainly one of the most important reasons for the success of Christianity was that somewhere in the 4th century, and this relates to the papacy, Christianity was adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, the story of Jesus is in Jerusalem or Galilee, but the headquarters of the major Christian denomination is not in Jerusalem, is it? The headquarters of the major denomination is in Rome. In fact, the Pope lives not too far from where the Roman emperors used to live. And in fact, some of the splendor and style of the church at its height reflects the splendor of the emperor and of Rome at its height. So he is the Bishop of Rome, the central figure of what we call the Catholic Church. Now, the third root is Roman Catholicism. The Christian world from the very beginning, like most religions, was divided by regional differences and by arguments. The church split up almost from the beginning into two parts, an eastern part where Greek was the prevailing language and a western part where Latin was the prevailing language. We call them the Eastern Church and the Western Church, the Greek Church and the Latin Church. The center of the Greek Church were three cities: Constantinople, Alexandria in Egypt, and Antioch in Syria. And the center of the Western Church was obviously, the Latin Church was obviously Rome. In time, the Roman Catholic Church, the Western Church, which was the weaker of the two to begin, smaller and weaker, ultimately achieved supremacy within the framework of Christianity. It became the largest Christian denomination around for a very simple reason. Another religion arose in the East called Islam. And Islam went out and conquered most of the Greek East. They took Egypt, they took Syria, they took Palestine, they took North Africa. And in 1453, the Turks crossed over into Europe and they took Constantinople, which today is called Istanbul. The only part of the Christian world which was not taken by the Muslims was the Western Church. And so the Western Church, having started out inferior, ended up as the remaining center. So the leader of the Western Church, who was the Bishop of Rome, who was the Pope, now emerges as what? The central figure of Christianity. And of course, the fourth root is in the institution of the papacy itself. At one time, there were essentially 4 popes. There were 3 in the East, in the Greek East. I mentioned them to you. The Bishop of Alexandria, the Bishop of Antioch, and the Bishop of Constantinople, who took the titles Patriarch. The one in Alexandria in Egypt actually used the word Papa, Pope. And of course there was the one in the West, which was Rome. Ultimately, and this again is a sign of the growth of the papacy, the other 3 fell under Muslim control. Country. The bishop of the patriarch of Antioch, that's an Arab country, and the patriarch in Alexandria, he's in a what? He's in an Arab country, a Muslim country. So the papacy also grew in terms of its significance and its power through the Muslim victories. Now, the papacy as an institution itself did not start out as the powerful institution it is today. When it began, there was the Bishop of Rome, who had the prestige of being the Bishop of Rome. But to turn the Bishop of Rome into the absolute monarch of the largest denomination of Christianity took time. So let me mention what I call the 4 events that transformed the papacy, that turned the job into something more than simply a regional bishop. The first was the collapse of the western part of the Roman Empire. In 476, the last Roman emperor in the West was dismissed. And in fact, there was no effective secular ruler, Roman ruler in the West after 476. The one figure of significance in Rome was the Bishop of Rome, Rome having become Christian. And in fact, when the German barbarians invaded Italy, came south of the Alps, the only figure that was around who could mobilize the people against them was the Pope. He was not only a religious figure, he was also a political figure as well. He became the symbol of resistance to the barbarian invasions, and that elevated his authority. It was Leo III, for instance, the Pope in the 5th century, even before the Roman emperor fell, the last one, who went out to meet Attila the Hun. The Huns were marching on Rome, and it was Leo. The Roman emperor had hidden himself in Ravenna. Was he there for a festival? I don't know. No, he had hidden himself in Ravenna. It was Pope Leo that went out to meet Attila, who was no small figure to meet. And it was he, through bribes and whatever, who persuaded Attila to withdraw and not to sack Rome. So the authority of the Pope rose because the emperor went and somebody had to take his place. In many respects, the Pope still remains the Emperor of Rome. I mean, the great palaces, right? The great place. Does anybody know who the Italian president is? Not even the Italians. I mean, nobody knows, right? He's in Rome, by the way. Does anybody want to see him? The second was a controversy that arose in the Greek East that's sort of separated the East from the West. The controversy is a big controversy in religion. It started all the way back with the Jews. The issue had to do with whether you were allowed painting and sculptures of God. What happened in Judaism, the answer was no. But when Christianity came to the Greco-Roman world, it was a world filled with gorgeous paintings and gorgeous sculpture. I mean, do you say no to Greek sculpture? Do you say no to Roman painting? Well, most people who were converted to Christianity in the Greco-Roman Empire wanted to keep paintings and sculpture. But in the 8th century, influenced by the rising power of Islam that also said no, a movement occurred in the eastern part of the Christian world. It has a fancy name which you can use for a spelling bee in case you want to run one. The word is iconoclasm. It has the word icon in it. Icon is a painting. One who wants to smash paintings is an iconoclast, and he belongs to something called iconoclasm. Not a bad word, all right? And the iconoclasts took over the Eastern Church, and they smashed statues, paintings, whatever. In the end, in the Eastern Church, a compromise was reached, which is status in the Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox Church, which is you can have paintings, icons, but you can't have statues. Well, for the people in the Latin West, they didn't like that. And in fact, the Pope in Rome became the champion of the opposition to this force. And what it did was it separated the West from the authority in the East, lending greater strength and power to the papacy. The third is the Great Reform, which occurred in the 10th and 11th centuries. When the church began in both the East and the West, the discipline of the church was sometimes hard to enforce. And so many priests, well, they were married and they had children and whatever, and they handed down their parishes to their children and whatever. Things were sort of chaotic. And then in the 10th century, in a city, a little town with a big monastery in Burgundy by the name of Cluny. If you're a member of Cluny, if you live in Cluny, you're a Cluniac. That's what it's called, the Cluniac Reform. I didn't make it up. I'm just giving you the word. All right. So Cluny is still there, and in Cluny, there arose a movement to clean up the church. And the main program of Cluny was, priests may not marry. They have to give their entire and complete loyalty to the church. You've got to clean this act up. And in fact, 4 graduates of Cluny became popes. And what they instituted was, of course, the Cluniac Reform, which was now to require all priests, certainly bishops, not to marry. And it did improve things in terms of the church. Now you had personnel who worked for the church who had no interest other than the church. They didn't have their wife, their children, their grandchildren, whatever else it is. And the church shaped up. And in a religious age, there were thousands and thousands of people who were willing to forego marriage and sex in order to enter this holy church. And the popes who initiated the reform, the bishops of Rome, who now became the central heads of this celibate organization, increased their power enormously. And the last thing that was to raise the papacy to its ultimate was something called the Crusades. The end of the 11th century, the beginning of the 12th century. The Christian world went to war with the Muslim world. We call that war the Crusades. The person who mobilized Europe for the Crusades was the Pope. And by so doing, he now arranged to become more powerful than any of the kings in Europe. Because whether you were French or German or English or Italian didn't make any difference. You served in the Pope's army and you wore the Pope's uniform, which was a cross. And so powerful did the Pope become that when even the Emperor of Germany challenged his authority, the Pope is very famous, Gregory VII, required the Emperor of Germany to crawl on his knees up a high mountain to beg forgiveness. By the time we get to Innocent III, whose papacy stretches from around 1198 to 1215, by the time we get there, the papacy has now become the most powerful Christian position ever invented or ever created. There is supreme authority. He is the commander-in-chief, if you will, of the most powerful segment of the Christian world. And in fact, much of the authority of the Pope today derives from the success of the story that I have described to you, that led all the way up to the 13th century. However, and this is also the story of the papacy, there were crises, and I have to mention the crises because the crises affected what happened to the Pope, both positively and negatively. The first was the French crisis, somewhere in the 13th century and the 14th century. The King of France suddenly came to feel very strong and powerful. He was the leader of the most powerful country in Western Europe, the richest, and he was not willing to accept the authority of the Pope, fully and in all things. So he arranged to do something that was to weaken the papacy for a century. He actually got a Frenchman elected Pope, and then he told the Frenchman to move from Rome to a place in France called Avignon. Nice festival. Didn't go on this year because of the unions. Okay. But move from Rome to Avignon, and in fact, for a period of 60 years, the Pope didn't even live in Rome. He lived under the control and under the finger of the French king, and that was to undermine the authority of the Pope to some degree. The second great crisis was the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a result in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century of the European people, the people in Western Europe, discovering their own power and producing a new economy with enough prosperity so that people began to think about this world more than they were thinking about the next world. And as that happened, that also happened to the papacy. In the 15th century and the early part of the 16th century, the Pope, who had returned to Rome, now got caught up in building. Splendor, all the things we go to see in Italy, all the things having to do with the church, whatever, that cost money. Now get money, build, splendor in this world. And along the way, the papacy found itself caught up in a struggle. That is, the Pope got so caught up in the struggle of establishing his power in Italy that he came to see himself as the king of Italy and then went to war with the Medici and all these other people. I mean, he forgot what his job was about. The third crisis, the one that is most familiar, happened following these two, which weakened the authority of the papacy, of the Pope, is something called the Reformation, which occurred in the 16th century, in which almost all of Northern Europe rose up in a giant rebellion against the Pope and created the Protestant world. Now, by the middle of the 16th century, the authority of the Pope, which had been high, fell. And it was at the end of the 16th century that the Church and the Pope decided to take strong action to restore the power of the Church and the power of the papacy. What did he do? Very simple. The Pope called a council, which is called the Council of Trent, a town in northern Italy. And at that council, which lasted for over 20 years, there came out a series of decisions which now presented the Church in a defensive posture. Before, the Church was in what I call a very expansive posture. Now it's in a defensive posture. There's the Protestant enemy out there. We have to what? Put up the walls, whatever it is. Discipline. And they were assisted in this by the coming of one of the most loyal elements in the Church of the papacy. It's an order founded in the 16th century. Its name is the Jesuits. And the Jesuits now became the instruments of the the policies of the church. The program to fight the Reformation is called the Counter-Reformation. It involved, one, the creation of a series of questions and answers called the Catechism, which you are supposed to memorize. They don't ask the question and then say, what do you think the answer is? Do you understand? There's a question and there is a what? And there is an answer, and you memorize both the question and the answer. That is called the Catechism. That comes out of the end of the 16th century. It was to enforce discipline in the church. The second thing was the total and absolute repression of any opinion that deviated from the official opinions to be found in the Catechism. For that, there was something called the Holy Office that was created. The other name for the Holy Office is the Inquisition. And attached to the Inquisition, of course, was the index, the list of books that you were not allowed to read on penalty of terrible punishments, either here or later. The church was what? Pulling in, strengthening itself against the enemy. The third was the reform of the clergy, which have been following the Pope and becoming more and more this worldly. Now the Jesuits set the model. We give our life to what? The church. And although we lost all of Northern Europe, what we're now going to do, the expansive part of our struggle, is we're going to sail to the New World, Asia and Africa, and we're going to convert as many of the natives that we can find. And they did, by the way. It's an incredible story. Look at the dedication of all these people. They traveled thousands of miles all over the world to convert people to the Catholic faith. And the final element was, in order for us to fight this war, it's like a war against terrorism. The war against Protestants was like a war against terrorism. In order for us to fight this war, we need a strong central command. We don't need the ACLU. And therefore, ironically, although almost one half of the church left to become Protestant, the power of the papacy increased. Because the Pope became the symbol of the what? The leader of the war, the resistance that was going to defend the faith, and that all went together. The Pope, the Jesuits, the Catechism, the whole organization now together, the people of faith. Well, if that had all remained the same, then in fact the power of the Pope would still be unquestioned. The great crisis that the church now met is the one that's still continuing. It won't go away. I mean, it's there. It's simply there. It will not go away. And that threat appeared at the end of the 17th and in the 18th century. It's a movement that we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was reflected in a series of changes that took place in Western Europe and in Western European culture, which are still continuing to this day. The first change is a massive change in the economy, which would move people over a period of 2 centuries from the countryside into big cities. The change is the emergence of a new source of power that many people think is equal in power to prayer. The power of science. Oh. As I mentioned before, most of the people in this room, including myself, would not be here. Do you understand? None of us would be here without science. So I mean, it's an incredible new power. But with science came a method for the discovery of truth, which was deeply disturbing to the church, which was built on the power of faith. Science rejects the power of faith for the power of evidence. And so now it encourages questioning, challenging, changing answers. And for the church, that was deeply, it still is. I mean, it's like, it just goes on and on and on, because it's not just technology. Science isn't just technology. Science is a new way of looking at truth, how you find it out. So science and the catechism, you see, are opposed, because with science you don't memorize the answer. You ask the question and then say, oh, I think, I think, Now, obviously, if you're a naive person, you go to the biology class and simply memorize the answers in the biology textbook. But if you're practicing science, that isn't the way you would approach it. Certainly one of the challenges of the Enlightenment was the mood of the church was always pessimistic, which is, this life is a vale of tears. Get ready for the next. But what the Enlightenment did, because it increased people's power, improved the standard of their living, was to give them a sense of optimism. Maybe I can live longer. Maybe I can enjoy life here. Maybe I can have pleasure. Maybe I can find happiness here. I don't have to wait for the next life, the whole thing. Well, that's subversive. Because the next thing you know is people are devoting their time to finding happiness here and not preparing to getting happiness later. One of the great challenges was the emergence, and it's a tremendous challenge, of the new clergy. The new clergy were all those people who were the people of science, who were now located in an institution that was the rival to the church, the university. They had titles like professor. And they claimed also to have vital information about the world. By the middle of the 19th century, if people were inviting somebody for a lecture to talk about biology, sociology, whatever else, they weren't inviting the clergy, they were inviting the professor. What it did was, it didn't fire the clergy, it simply moved them over to the what? To the side, and now another, I call them the new clergy, moved in. One of the major challenges, of course, with urbanization was the destruction of the old family. The old extended family now turns into the small nuclear family, and the small nuclear family now lives in an urban environment, and in that urban environment, children don't do what their parents did. They go to school, go to another profession, another kind of work. Out of that emerges the idea of the individual. And once you get the idea of the individual, you come to the idea of personal freedom. And once you get the idea of personal freedom, you get people opening their mouths to people in authority and either telling them off or saying, I don't agree, or whatever else it is. Totally subversive of an institution that wants what? Tight controls. I mean, and it wouldn't stop because the economy itself was so successful. One of the great challenges was the emergence as a result of a new form of government, both in Western Europe and in North America, that we call democracy. Now, the Roman Catholic Church historically, like all churches, historically, like all governments historically, were not democratic. Well, it wasn't democratic. Its head was not chosen by a vote of the members of the church. There was a small body of people who were given the right to choose the Pope. What rights now adhere to the people at the bottom? Because in democracy, all rulers are chosen by the ruled. Well, once the cat's out of the bag, do you understand? I mean, so now you got all these people running around. Many of them are born Roman Catholic. They're born into countries where there is something called democracy. And now they're trained in this thing called democracy, and now they're saying, I mean, I don't agree. I mean, can't the administration change? I mean, I don't know. Well, I mean, it's subversive. And of course, along with all this change, urbanization, individualism, came a new role for women. They were no longer tied to producing children for a farm life. They now lived in cities, and now many of them were getting lower educations, and then they were getting higher educations. They were totally excluded from the power structure of the church. Not just Roman Catholicism, it was true of Judaism, it was true of Islam. I'm not picking on it, but it certainly was true of Roman Catholicism. And now you're confronted with, what do you do with the rising self-esteem and image of women? So let me try to describe the three responses. The first response in the 18th century didn't last very long. The first response in the middle of the 18th century was the idea that the church might be able to cooperate with the change. And in the middle of the 18th century, one of the things that happened was that the church itself suppressed the Jesuit order. And they did that in response to many of the people in the various leadership roles of the nations of Western Europe that said, the Jesuits are on the way, we need to make progress, the whole thing. Suppressed the order, the church did, but it recovered very shortly from it. What made the church recover was an event so overwhelming that it was to color the responses of the church through the 19th and the 20th century. And in fact, John Paul II, in some respects, is a response to that event. In 1789, the people of France began the overthrow of their government. And in overthrowing the king, they also were fired up to overthrow the other rulers of the country that controlled their lives and whom they now regarded as obsolete. One of the groups high on their list of the revolutionaries was the church. And they proceeded to take over the church, close down churches, and to separate religion from government. Oh. And then a general, a French or Italian general, by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, then swept with the French revolutionary armies through Europe, and wherever he went, he did the same thing. And then to humiliate the church, he captures Rome. I mean, one of the most humiliating scenes, I don't know whether it was in the movies too. Napoleon decides to call himself emperor. He invites the Pope to crown him. The Pope arrives, prepared to crown him. Napoleon takes the crown and what? Crowns himself. I mean, you got the message. The message is, who needs you? It's an act of humiliation. So it was very clear now to the leaders of the church, in particular to the Pope, that cooperating with this force would only mean the destruction of the church. So the church tightened up and now began what I would call the response called the rejection of the Enlightenment. And the Pope who exemplified that the most was a Pope who reigned between 1846 and 1870. His name, Pius IX. It's a very controversial figure. Pius IX was responsible for one of the most repressive regimes that Rome ever had, the city of Rome ever had. But Pius IX has now been nominated by John Paul II to be a saint. Very controversial. I mean, he's associated with an incident, certainly in terms of the Jewish people, called the Mortara case, where a housekeeper, unbeknownst to her employers, baptizes, a Catholic housekeeper baptizes a Jewish child. The child is taken away from the parents because the child is Catholic. It's called the famous Mortara case. And in fact, the government in Rome, the Pope, refused to return the child because the baptism is irrevocable. It was a day and it was the middle of the 19th century, but it was something like from the middle of the Middle Ages. It was a sign of the attitude. So Pius IX, and Pius IX, of course, now says the leading force that's going to make the church survive is the Pope. We need a centralized organization. The war isn't against the Protestants anymore. The war is against the atheists. And for that we need a strong, we hear this message all the time, we need a what? We need a strong central control. The sign of it was that in 1870, 1871, before the Italians took Rome and made it their capital, while the Pope was still in charge, he calls a council called Vatican Council I. And Council I is a proof that is highly controversial, and that is the theory of papal infallibility. A papal infallibility is that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra from the throne, whatever he says is the voice of God. Not even Innocent III, the height of the papacy, said this. And this statement was made at a time when the papacy was beginning to what? To shake. It was an assertion. So now the theory of papal infallibility, we're going to face the enemy. Following Pius IX came Leo the 13th and Pope Leo, and Pope Leo was interesting. I mean, he also sustained the ideology of the Pius IX program, but he modified it a little bit, and he was followed by Pius X, and he was followed by Benedict XV, and he was followed by Pius XI, and he was followed by the Pope that many of us are familiar with, which is Pius XII, and out of it came an ideology. If the Counter-Reformation was the ideology against the Protestant world, the ideology that emerged in the 19th and 20th century, which reinforced the tightness of the church, was the ideology in the war against secularism. So what did this ideology consist of? It's very important. One, that the church requires authoritarian government, because the church is the voice of God, and God is not elected to office. The second is anti-capitalism. Anti-capitalism means not that we're opposed to private property. We're opposed to economic development that undermines the traditional family and promotes too much the idea of personal freedom and the consumer culture, and the word that is a favorite one certainly in what I call the ideology, materialism. It is anti-socialist. It's anti-socialist because the socialists in Europe embraced atheism, and therefore what? The church must fight it tooth and nail, although Pope Leo, at the end of the 19th century, in order to indicate that the church was not opposed to the working class, which it saw as exploited by both socialists and capitalists, came out in favor of the rights of the working class and appropriate compassion by authorities for their needs. It was anti-science. Pius X condemned, in a series of decrees, condemned the basic elements, if you will, of modern science, including the idea of evolution. And it was anti-democracy. Democracy is an inappropriate form of government because democracy may, in the end, bring to power people and institutions that do not embrace the correct view of God, which is the Roman Catholic view. It's anti-sexuality. The anti-sexuality theme, of course, is carried out from what we call the medieval church, and that is that the ideal form of life, if you can do it, is celibacy. Of course, we don't want everybody to do it, because if everybody did it, there would be no church. But I mean, no, the point is celibacy. It is the form of holiness, and therefore you abstain from sexual activity. Clergy should be role models of what? of anti-sexuality. And part of the ideology was separation. We live in a world now where there's a war. And therefore, if you are a member of the church, you do not set foot in any other institution that is not Roman Catholic. You may not go to an Episcopal church. You may not go to a Presbyterian church. You certainly can't go to a meeting of the Socialist Party. You can't do any of these things. So I remember the period of separation. It was overwhelming. And the thing that turned the war into something very powerful was that in 1917, a revolution took place. The French Revolution looked like nothing. It's called the what? The Bolshevik Revolution, and out of it came the great threat of communism, and communism is identified with atheism, and now the war. By the time we get to the papacies of Pius XI and Pius XII, communism is represented by the Soviet Union. It may be spreading all over the world, and with the Depression coming in the 1930s, what do? And that became the choice now of the church and of the papacy. In the 1930s, and certainly in the early 1940s, the papacy had two choices in Europe. Democracy was gone. There was communism and there was fascism. And if you're the leader of this church concerned about the survival of this church, you don't like either, but which one do you dislike the most? The answer is very clear. The force that you dislike the most is communism. And therefore the church, it's not a great mystery, established alliances, if you will, with fascist governments. They made a deal with Mussolini, and they ultimately made a deal with Adolf. They certainly weren't prepared to make a deal with Stalin. They were very disturbed in August 1939 when Stalin and Hitler made a deal, because that was so who's on what side? And so there never emerged out of the church any what I would call real condemnations of fascism. There were many denunciations of communism. That was common. But there were very few denunciations of fascism coming out of the high authorities. Certainly there were hundreds and thousands of Roman Catholic priests, nuns, whatever, who were anti-fascist. That isn't the issue. The issue is that the central organization was ambivalent. And in fact, in June of 1940, if you were sitting in Rome, it was not clear that fascism would lose. Was it clear that when France fell to the Nazis, was it clear that fascism would lose? See, I grew up in America. We always assume that America is going to win. Right? And it never occurred to me that we would ever what? Could we lose? We can't lose. We're always going to win. But if you were objective, sort of, in June of 1940, it would not be considered dumb if you did that. Well, World War II comes, and